in London, talking to us about using theory of change to design and evaluate interventions for digital inclusion. With that, I'll hand over to Joe.
Thanks, Greg. Good morning, everybody from London. So this is a webinar about theory of change. Theory of change won't protect you from the coronavirus, but it may help you to develop an effective project for digital inclusion connected with the coronavirus. And it's not as far-fetched as it sounds, because one of the issues we're beginning to see now with the lockdown of 20% population is that a lot of people who don't have access to technologies are even more socially excluded and isolated than they would normally be. So it's actually quite relevant, MEDICI and digital inclusion, for our current situation. So what I'm going to do in today's webinar is to start off with trying to describe what a theory of change is. I'm then going to cover why is it useful, how do we develop one, some tips on how to do an effective theory of change, and then some resources you can use to understand more fully how it works. So what is it and how do we use it and why? Theory of change essentially gives you a roadmap that takes you from an initial problem that you want to try to solve to the end of the project, which is the solutions that you apply to solve the problem. So it's a kind of narrative, a journey that takes you from the problem that you want to solve to the end results. And it connects the problem you want to solve to the change at the end of the project, or the impacts by the activities you carry out to solve the problem, which create outputs, which lead to outcomes, which eventually lead to impacts or changes. So why use it? Well, it's pretty important in designing projects that are effective. So you can use it for strategic planning, designing projects. You can use it for getting stakeholders involved in the project, for engaging and collaborating with people. You can use it particularly for evaluation and sustainability building, because it gives you evidence that your project works. And you can use it for communication. If you're doing promotion on a project that you want to send out to the world, it's very useful to have a very clear picture for people to understand about what it is you're trying to change and how you're going to do it and what the results are going to be. So essentially, theory of change helps you to step out of the narrow confines of your project. In a lot of cases, people tend to get bogged down in their vision of what they're trying to do, and they don't see the bigger picture. So what it helps to do is to help you connect the practical things you want to do in a project to the bigger picture, the changes that you want to make in the broader sense. So how do you do it? Basically, we have a presenting problem. At the end of the project, if it's a digital inclusion project, it might be something around trying to change the situation of migrant women who don't have access to technology. So that's the problem. At the end of it, the impact, the change you want to make to that problem could be increasing the knowledge and skills of migrant women in order that they are more effectively engaged in the digital society. And connecting the problem with the changes, the impacts, the inputs that you have, it's the resources that are available to your project, the activities you then do that use the inputs, the outputs that result, the products from the activities. When they're used, they lead to outcomes, And as the project develops and comes to the end of its life cycle, these outcomes accumulate and combine together to produce the changes you want to do. So it's pretty much a simple journey of progress, a change journey from the problem to the solution. So the first step in constructing a theory of change is to present the problem. What is the problem we're trying to change? And more importantly, what are the factors that cause this problem to happen? The second step in a theory of change, it's almost like backtracking. The second step is going to the end of the project. What is it that I want to change in this situation? What are the impacts I hope to be able to deliver? And then you backtrack from the changes at the end of the project back to the beginning. So step 3 is what outcomes, what changes for the target groups of my project do I want to achieve by what I do. And steps 4 and 5 are what resources do I have to make these changes, how do I apply them in activities, and what will be the result of that application in terms of products or outputs that will occur in the project. And then step 6 is around the theory. If I do this, if I take step X, will it lead to outcome Y, and will that eventually lead to the impacts, outcome Z at the end of the project? And you also have assumptions. Assumptions are the theories or the assumptions behind the whole project idea. So the assumptions are, if I do this, this will happen. And if I do this, it will connect to this. So we start off with the step 1, the presenting problem. You need to have a problem to solve and a theory of what causes that problem. And if we take an example of a situation or a problem in which too many older people are not taking advantage of the opportunities of the digital economy in society, and that's connected to the problem that welfare services that support older people are not geared up to help them use digital tools. And our theory of why this happens may be something like, well, it's because older people are afraid of digital technologies and tools, and because they're afraid, they feel ashamed of their lack of digital skills, so they don't want to get involved in using technologies. And a second theory or assumption about why this happens is that service workers in support services are not very well trained in using digital tools to support older people. So that's our starting point. So we then have some resources to make the changes we want to make, and we need to identify what those are. So those could be money. You could have for your project a grant from the European Commission. You could get co-funding from sponsors, from charities or whatever. Another resource is the staff you have in your organization, the time that you're going to invest in the project, partner organizations that you're connected with, stakeholders, and other groups that have an interest in the solution that you're trying to do. Other resources, inputs might be technology, materials, buildings, premises, or whatever. So you need to identify what these resources are in order to then construct a design that enables you to effectively make use of these resources to achieve the impacts you want to achieve at the end of your project. So you use the resources then to carry out things, to do things, to take actions that are intended to achieve your aims at the end of the project. So the activities might be, for example, getting stakeholders involved in your project through workshops, through dissemination events. They might be activities that produce software, digital tools to help older people. They might be a training program, training activities to help youth workers or support workers get the skills required to work more effectively with older people. And they might be sustainability activities so that your project outputs are actually used after the project's finished. So you need to list all of these actions you need to take as part of the theory of change design. So these activities, of course, lead to products. They create concrete things that result as a result of the activities you carry out. And in this case, the outputs might be, well, we have an action research plan in which we work with older people and support workers to get them more involved in digital technologies. We've created a technical platform that can host our training program. We have a training program for support workers and older people that gets them to be able to understand how to use digital tools effectively. And we have a sustainability plan and toolkit that tells us how we can roll out these outputs at the end of the project. So the use of these outputs, the utilization in practice, lead to outcomes. And these are changed in values, attitudes, knowledge, competences, skills, and more importantly, behaviors that result from the project you're doing. And it's important to understand that there are two types of outcome. A lot of people tend to conflate these things into one. But there are immediate outcomes and intermediate outcomes. So the immediate outcomes are changes in awareness, in knowledge, in attitudes, in competences. So for example, in this project, an improved understanding of what older people need in terms of digital tools, or an increased awareness of the benefits by older people of the use of the tools. Intermediate outcomes are the results of that change in awareness, attitudes, and competences through action. So if you apply the increased competences, knowledge, understanding of what digital tools can do in activities, then your assumption is this will lead to changes in behaviors of older people, of welfare support workers, of organizational and changes in organizational structures of services that help older people. So the actual changes in behaviors and structures. And together, as the project develops, these outcomes combine together and aggregate to create the outcomes, the impacts you want at the end of the project, the big changes that you want to see at the end of its life cycle. So it's the ultimate ambition for change. What I want to change in a large-scale way as a result of my project. And some examples of the impacts you might want to see, the changes you might want to see, are that older people have better access to digital services. That increases their social equality and social inclusion. And if enough welfare organizations adopt these changes, then it will lead to improved services for older people throughout the EU generally. So these are the bigger picture impacts in the longer term. So assumptions are really important. Assumptions are kind of the glue that knit together the theory of change. And the assumptions of what happens if I do action X, and what will that lead to in the longer term. The beliefs about how a project will work, about the people involved, and the context in which it operates. So one assumption about the context of your project might be that, well, what we'll need to have is the political, environmental, and economic conditions that support change. More importantly, in practical terms, your assumptions are also the linkages between what you do in the projects that lead to outcomes. So if we take action X, it will produce output Y. The use of output Y will lead to outcome Z, and in turn, that will lead to the impacts we want to see at the end of the project. So you need to understand the assumptions, the causal relationships between your activities and the supposed outcomes that stem from those, in order to understand whether your project is going to work or not. You also need indicators. You need to have some way of measuring whether the assumptions you have in your theory of change actually are working in practice. And these indicators need to measure and monitor your theory of change as it develops. And if you get in data from these indicators that are not right, well, you need to go back to your theory of change and adjust it so that it reflects the reality that is measured by your indicators. So the theory of change will help you to develop indicators that enable you to evaluate the outcomes and impacts of the project you're trying to do. So for example, you can measure outputs by the number of stakeholder workshops you have with stakeholders, the number and type of end users, older people involved in your project. You can measure outcomes by things like the increase in older people's awareness of digital tools, the percentage increase in digital competences of support workers who do your training program, and you can measure impacts, the longer term and macro level effects and changes of your project through things like, well, because of our project, we've saved €5 million in social care because the use of digital technologies has made welfare services more effective. So you need to divide your indicators into output indicators that measure products and outputs, outcomes indicators that measure the changes in the medium and short term as a result of using the outputs, and impacts, the longer term macro level results and changes that are associated with what you're doing in the project. So this is a short case study of how it works in practice. This is a project that Greg and myself were working on called Keystone, and it's based in South London, where we observed that vulnerable young people locally are increasingly marginalised, and the approaches taken by youth services locally to broaden their opportunities don't work very well. So our hypothesis, our theory in this project was that youth workers believe that involving young people in designing their own futures and having a say in the opportunities they have in the future, using digital technologies would be a more promising way of doing things than the traditional project that aim to involve young people on the margins. So we use a theory of change to work out how the project should look like and how we'll measure the results. And this is a simple template. You can divide it into the columns, the presenting problem, the inputs you have, the activities you're going to do using those inputs, resources, the outputs that result from the activities, the outcomes that you expect to happen as a result of the use of those outputs, and ultimately the impacts or the major changes that you think are going to be made through that project. So we have things like the presenting problem is that young people are increasingly disengaged from society. Things need to be included in sustainable futures for Europe. Current approaches don't work very well. Our impacts are desired and expected changes at the end of the project to this situation is a reduction in the social inclusion of vulnerable young people. And we begin to fill in the outcomes columns. So through the project, we expect that young people will apply their talents to solve community problems. We expect that young people will improve their digital and social competences as a result of being involved in the project. We expect that other stakeholders will improve their skills in creating projects that are design-led and actually involve young people collaboratively. And we also expect, as a result of the changes we make through the project, more effective youth services. So the activities we do to get to those changes include things like workshops, a training program for youth workers and young people, and evaluation of the whole thing. And the outputs from those may be something like apps, the design of a community lab, which will help young people collaborate and co-design solutions to problems that in their community, working with youth workers, and a development program for local stakeholders, which will teach them how to co-produce initiatives with young people. And then the resources we have is funding, multidisciplinary teams, and a community lab, and actual premises with resources that we can use. And then the assumptions, we need to then specify what it is that we think will lead the causal links that will result in the actions we take. So that's how to do it. So to do a good theory of change, you need collaboration. You can't do this stuff top down. You need to involve stakeholders, target groups in your project, in co-designing the design of the project, in understanding and coming to a collective vision of how the project will work. It has to be plausible, particularly when you're working with marginalized groups. You have to be able to sell it to them. The last thing marginalized groups need is more research. That doesn't actually change their situation. It needs to be feasible and testable, and this is why you need to develop indicators that measure the progress of your change journey accurately. So if through measurement of the progress of that journey you find that you're not getting to the position that you're supposed to be getting, then you need to rethink and look back at the theory of change and adjust it, and in light of the data you're collecting through your measurement indicators. It has to be iterative, as I've just said. You need to constantly look back at your theory of change, its construction, the assumptions it makes, the causal chains that link activities to outputs to outcomes and so on, in order to adjust the theory of change to the reality on the ground as your project develops. So essentially it's a map, change journey, a narrative of the progress you make from a problem you want to solve to the kind of nirvana, the heaven at the end of the project, assuming your project succeeds. Presenting problem, impacts, outcomes, outputs, and the inputs, resources, and activities you need to be able to make that change journey possible. It's absolutely essential that when you start a project for digital inclusion, that you develop a theory of change collaboratively, as I've said. And the best way to do that is through a co-creation workshop. So to do it effectively, you need to invite key people, target users, stakeholders, funders, networks, anybody else that has an interest in changes that you want to make through the project. You need at least 3 hours to do this because it's quite a complex iterative project. You need to be able to represent the perspectives and voices of all of the stakeholders involved. You need to make it inclusive. I mean, MEDICI is all about digital inclusion. If you want to design a project to support vulnerable groups and engage them more effectively in the digital society, you need to do stuff that actually engages them as co-producers rather than just passive participants in a project. Use stuff that actually is creative and practical, so you can use post-it notes, colors, flip charts, and so on and so forth. It's also useful to prompt people, so you may have some prompt questions. Why do you think we should do it this way? You need to focus on the why and the how, not just the what. So don't just focus on the impacts you want to, the change you want to make through the project, but this theory, this progression, this linear progression of cause and effect. So the key to this is to create causal chains that take you from the problem to the solution through relevant activities, relevant outputs that create outcomes and impacts. You need to expect that people will have different views on what outcomes you're trying to create, and you need to be able to reconcile those different views in order to come to a common perspective and a common theory of what your project's going to do. And of course, the timescales are really important. So you're trying to do this change narrative, this journey from problem to solution through inputs, activity, outputs, outcomes. And you need to time those things. You need to have a clear picture of when you're going to do the activities, when those are likely to realize outputs, and when the use of those outputs are likely to realize the outcomes you want. So this is a very basic template to do it. As I've said earlier, you can divide it into columns. What's the presenting problem? What are the impacts, the changes we want to make? What are the stages in between? The outcomes we expect, the outputs we're going to produce, the activities that are going to produce the outputs, and the resources we have to do it. And then crucially, the assumptions you have in your theory that will make all this happen. And an alternative is to use the same template, but also include the indicators that you need to develop to measure how your theory of change and your journey is progressing as it goes through the project life cycle. So you need to have output indicators, outcome indicators, and impact indicators. Drawing it up, you use that template to then create a classic theory of change map in those steps that I started with. So starting off with the presenting problem, then going to the impacts, then producing the outcomes that you expect to happen in the project, the intermediate and immediate outcomes, changing in firstly behaviors, knowledge, competences, and so on, and secondly changes in actual behaviors, including organizational behaviors. Then plotting what are the activities we need to do to create those outputs, and what are the resources that we need to have in order to produce the activities. And then how do we measure these things? How do we measure progress along this change journey? So develop the indicators that you need to measure outputs, to measure the immediate and intermediate outcomes, and ultimately the impacts. And then you also need to produce a map of the assumptions. What are the underlying assumptions that we have that this project will work? That if we take action X, it will lead to outcome Y, and eventually the aggregation of those outcomes will lead to the impacts we want. So specifying the assumptions that underlie the theory is absolutely crucial to making this work effectively.
I'm going to wind this up. Thanks to Joe and thanks to everybody who's been present today. As I said earlier, you will all be sent a a link to the within the MEDICI project framework and website. So this information will be made available to you. And you know, any more questions, then please do let us know. Continue asking questions by email or whatever. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to Joe. Thank you for taking part in this webinar, MEDICI's